Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to everyone to tonight's virtual webinar on open access publishing and the future of Native and Indigenous studies. My name is David Congdon, and I am the senior editor here at the University Press of Kansas. And on behalf of the entire team at the press, we're delighted that you made some time for us on Tuesday evening to join us for this webinar and conversation. And I hope you all enjoy it, and I'm very excited about the guest tonight we have. But before I begin, I want to have a few housekeeping items. First, tonight's conversation is being recorded and will be made publicly available after we're finished. We encourage everyone to participate by submitting questions using the Q&A tool. So that's down at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that and submit your questions to us using that. So we look forward to having a lively conversation afterwards, and we hope to get to as many questions as possible. So tonight's event is in celebration of the recent completion of the Kansas Open Books Project, which was an initiative by the University Press of Kansas to digitize out-of-print books and make them freely available online. Kansas Open Books was made possible by a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The project includes over 60 titles in the fields of history, political science, and our topic for tonight, Native American Indigenous Studies. For many of the books, we commissioned new prefaces and forewords, and two of the titles in the collection are by Joseph Herring, Kennecook the Kickapoo Prophet, published in 1988, and The Enduring Indians of Kansas, A Century and a Half of Acculturation, published in 1991. And the forewords for those books were written by two of our panelists tonight, Professors Kiara Vigil and Sarah Deer, whom you will hear more about in a moment. And that brings me to our moderator for this evening. Ty S. Edwards is an associate professor of history and the director of the Kansas Studies Institute at Johnson County Community College in Overland Park, Kansas. She is the author of Osage Women and Empire, Gender and Power, published by Kansas in 2018. And at this point, I will turn it over to her to introduce our panelists and begin our conversation. So thank you, Ty.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. We're so excited for you to be here to join us, to hear from these wonderful authors about their work and to hear about Kansas Open Books. I think we're going to have a wonderful conversation, and it's going to be really inspiring and educational and enjoyable on this stormy Kansas night. So let me introduce our panelists today. First, we have Sarah Deer, citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation. Sarah is a university distinguished professor at the University of Kansas and is the Chief Justice for the Prairie Island Indian Community Court of Appeals. She is also the author of The Beginning and End of Rape, Confronting Sexual Violence in Native America, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2015. We also have Farina King, Dene and citizen of the Navajo Nation, who is an associate professor of history at Northeastern State University and is the author of The Earth Memory Compass, Dene Landscapes and Education in the 20th Century, published by University Press of Kansas, hosting our event tonight in 2018. And then we also have Kiara Vigil, Dakota and Apache Heritage, who is also an associate professor of American Studies at Amherst College and is the author of Indigenous Intellectuals, Sovereignty, Citizenship, and the American Imagination, 1880 to 1930, published by Cambridge Press in 2015. So we are really excited to get our conversation started. I'm going to start us off with some questions and some discussion. You can feel free to enter your questions as we go in the chat, and we'll get to them after we have our initial conversation, and we look forward to addressing some of your thoughts and ideas as well. So as David mentioned, with the new Kansas Open Books project that makes a lot of University Press of Kansas titles available to the public, we want to start with Sarah and Kiara. Tell us why you were interested in writing these new forewords and prefaces to the books that you addressed, and what issues came to mind when you were writing it that you wanted to emphasize in those new introductions. Sarah, if you don't mind, would you like to go first?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So this is the paper book. I don't know if it's backwards to everyone, but this is The Enduring Indians of Kansas. And you can always tell how much I like a book by how many little Post-it flags are in it. The messier it is, the more I like it. And I was just earlier thinking today about when I first read this book, because I've read it several times. And I'm pretty sure it was in law school. And I was the kind of law student that often spent more time in the liberal arts library than the law library. I was raised in Wichita, Kansas, and my tribe is in Oklahoma. So I wasn't raised sort of immersed in Muskogee culture. And down in Wichita, we don't have tribes in that area of the state, right? So as I started to study Indian law in law school, I really felt I needed, as a Kansan, to get my bearings straight on the story. And the story is incredible. And the issues of tribal nations coming through Kansas, staying in Kansas, wanting to be in Kansas, wanting not to be in Kansas is just a fascinating story. And there's really no other book like it. So when I was excited that we're going to make it open book, and so that was, the book that I knew the best on the list of opportunities. And so I took a chance and decided to write a new foreword for it. And I'm really thrilled with the opportunity for people to be able to read this without cost. One of the other things that was sort of happening for me around the same time is I finished my studies at KU in 1999. And so for most of my higher ed, there was kind of this thing for a while where we weren't really sure if the internet was going to stick, like we were using email, but you didn't have to, like that time period. And so for me, the idea that you would be able to pick up a digital device, an iPad or even a smartphone, and read books, like that was not even in the realm of the imagination at that time. So now that we're in a different kind of world, I think it's great. I still like paper books. I like to obviously touch them and highlight them and put things on them, but not everybody does that. And so you're really addressing two issues: access, right? And then the generational difference, where somebody might not read this paper book, but they'll be willing to put it up on their screen. So when I wrote the foreword, I just really wanted to put it in a context of sort of, this is one of the only books about Kansas Indians. And I'm not a historian, so I had like a little hesitancy about critiquing the methodology. One of the things that I did point out, as an Indigenous feminist, is that, women, gender, those kinds of issues are not included in the book. And there's a variety of explanations for that. So that's one of the critiques that I offered, is that, that women of these tribes also have stories. So that's kind of how I approached it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. So Kiara, can you tell us the similar ideas and issues for you for your intro?
Sure. I was not at all familiar with Herring's Kennecott the Kickapoo Prophet. I really wasn't, which made me think that I should write a foreword for it, because how come I don't know about it, especially as a historian and a historian of the 19th, 20th century, Native American people, but individuals like Kennecott. So I was really struck by how his legacy is framed by Herring and the ways in which Herring labels him an American Indian patriot. There's a lot to unpack in that framing. And so I thought this is an opportunity with this foreword to, as Sarah mentioned, reach a lot of people, perhaps more people than one would, given the kind of digital format, the open access that people would have. And I was really interested in how to shape a foreword that would introduce this idea of nuance, multiple interpretations of Indigenous figures and their legacies. How do we think about Kennecott based off of what Herring says, and then what we also can know, from other kinds of sources, right? And so as an Indigenous studies scholar and as a cultural historian, I think I was really, really excited to think about Kennecott and how we might view his legacy, not just as an American Indian patriot, as Herring says, but perhaps as a complicated and even contradictory kind of figure who, does remarkable things to enable his people to survive in the face of colonization. So I was just really struck by that. And I asked a lot of questions in my foreword. I said things like, what is his legacy? And was he a freedom fighter, an accommodationist, a visionary? Maybe he's all of these things. Maybe he's more than that. How can we move beyond older framings that historians of Native history have used, talking about figures in terms of assimilation or acculturation? And instead of talking in those terms, how can we embrace the fullness of this figure and any contradictions that might be a part of his legacy, and how can that then perhaps reshape the way we think about including Kickapoo perspectives within American history, and even the centrality of Native American history within American history. So I think all of that made me really excited to write the foreword and to be part of this project.
Thank you so much for that, Kiara. And I would encourage everyone to go out and read these. There's no barrier to access, right? And they're really wonderful introductions, really accessible. And I think a lot of the audience would get a lot out of the whole book, but certainly these new introductions. Okay, turning to you, Farina, next. You've spoken publicly and personally about how important University Press of Kansas books on Indigenous studies, especially education, have been in your life and career. Can you share your thoughts on that with our audience today?
Yes, I'd be glad to. I think I often start with a story that I share with people. That for me, what really led me into the study was of history and scholarship, and even just learning, were to begin with my family stories, and particularly hearing about boarding school stories that my aunties, my uncles, my cousins went to Indian boarding schools. And then I started to have more questions about that. Because it wasn't like they talked about it all the time. Actually, it was a couple of my uncles served in World War II as Navajo code talkers, Albert Smith and George Smith. And I was encouraged to go and interview them by a history teacher in high school. And I thought, oh, what's the big deal about that? So I interviewed my uncle, and I learned, and I got roped in really into just the stories and learning more. And it actually was my uncle telling me about being sent to boarding school, prohibited and punished for speaking Navajo, the language that would literally save his life and many people, and all these different experiences. So how does this come to the University Press of Kansas is I started to ask my family more about boarding schools, but I wasn't really sure how to talk about it, because among Dene ancestral teachings, this isn't something we talk about at the dinner table or, around all the time or something. And I realized that even now with my first book, The Earth Memory Compass, that the University Press of Kansas worked with me on and published, were so supportive in that. I realized, like, talking about it more now, some family even come up to me and they're like, why were you talking about boarding school so much? This wasn't something we talked about. So then I went off to college and started to think about what books could I read to really understand more how people are talking about this. And it was, for me, an act of hybridization and a navigating, and this is something I'll talk about later with directions with Indigenous studies, is navigating, my positionality as a relative, that I am Bilagana, white settler through my mother, born for Kiaani, Towering House Clan, and Sinajini, Blackstreak Woods people, that relationship has, responsibilities to it, and how we talk about things through our ancestral Dene ways and practices. But in college, I thought about what books to read. And one of the first books that I read cover to cover, like really thoroughly, was David Wallace Adams' Education for Extinction. And it opened my eyes in so many ways. Like, yes, David is open about his positionality, especially meeting him later in life. But at that time, it was really eye-opening for me of getting a sense of what these schools, the agenda was, and how it functioned as an auxiliary of colonialism and all these different aspects that my family, they always were saying it, like they were doing things or showing things that was there, but I didn't know how to ask these questions. I didn't really understand more of the context. So that inspired me to delve into something that I knew was really hard. to be honest. And it's always painful, you know, to talk about. And it's really, as you know, now with the attention to unmarked mass graves, and then Deb Haaland as Secretary of Interior, pushing the federal Indian boarding school truth initiative. But for me, that it was that beginning with David Wallace Adams' work of connecting the dots, and then learning more works that the University Press of Kansas would publish over the years, you know, finding out there's all these other great Indigenous studies and works about not only Indian boarding schools, which University Press of Kansas has other works important in this area. Recently, Matthew Sekestua Gilbert's work, who has really been inspirational to me with how he approaches indigenizing methodologies, particularly as a historian, and seeking, you know, working with his community and all these dynamics. And Hopi Runners, you know, was his recent publication. It's not really called a Indian boarding school book like his first one, but it has a lot of connections and important ties to the questions of assimilation and aspects, right, of identity, and so many others that do that, like Phil Deloria's and Indians in Unexpected Places. So for me, you know, why I spoke publicly about this to wrap up is that it was emphasizing to people these personal connections of what it meant to me. And I would share a video of how I opened up my book for the first time, The Earth Memory Compass. And it was really such a powerful moment and so meaningful for me. I'm surrounded by my children, my posterity, you know, basically. And the book has David Wallace Adams' you know, recommendation on the back. And that was just beautiful, like coming full circle for me. And that I could show my kids that I dedicated it to them. And that it also recognized my dad's childhood and so many others as I continue to talk about other boarding schools today. I not that long ago heard a Dene woman come up to me and say, I felt like my childhood was stolen from me. So it's really powerful work here that is meaningful, and so much that this press has been a part of and contributing and supporting. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Farina. I've seen the video of Farina's kids seeing her open that book for the first time. It's posted online, and it is really wonderful. It is, and it's kind of you to share that with the public too. All right, so for all three of you, and if you don't mind, maybe we'll just keep the same order, Sarah, Kiara, and Farina, at least at first. Tell us about your experiences in academic publishing and how your work connects to trends in Indigenous studies.
Okay, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yes. Can you tell us about your experience with academic publishing and how your work connects to trends you see in Indigenous studies?
Well, I came to publishing in kind of a roundabout way. I'm a latecomer to academia. So I got my law degree at KU here in Lawrence back in 1999, and then I went and worked for the federal government for several years. And then I moved to Los Angeles, and I'm from the prairie. I did not fit in there at all, but I was traveling most of the time. But when I was at this nonprofit called the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, there was some funding made available from the Department of Justice to train or better prepare tribal citizens to appear in tribal court as lay advocates if they weren't going to have a law degree. And it had already kind of been set up before I arrived. They just needed someone to then write them. So I wrote a series of textbooks for Altamira Press, which is now, I think, Rowman and Littlefield. And they were basically introductory textbooks for a college student starting out at a tribal college and wanting to know about tribal legal studies. And so I had a positive experience with that. I was battling cancer through the bulk of that whole scene, but we ended up putting out 4 textbooks: intro, criminal, violence against women, and constitutions. All introductory texts for the Native or non-Native college student. The problem was, though, and this was, again, long time ago to it seems like now 2000s, where again, you know, we didn't have iPads yet. And so I did teach some online courses using those textbooks. And what we were able to do is just get the students free copies. Just we bought them through the grant, and then we sent them out to the reservations. So I was teaching online like before we did that. And that just reminds me of one other thing. We think open books does mean, you know, everyone has access, but not everybody does have internet. And those who do have internet may not have the kind of high-speed connection that they need to really be able to take advantage of this. So I just wanted to mark that. But that's how I came into academia. I sort of waltzed from that position into a visiting professorship in St. Paul, Minnesota. You know, I came back to Kansas. I never should have left. But then I joined academia about 10 or 12 years after finishing my studies. And I just kind of picked up where I left off, and writing those books and then writing my solo authored book. It's a very positive experience. It's very stressful. There's a lot on Indigenous scholars, like, don't screw this up, right? Because you may be the only one writing about this for a while. So I think that it's important that, you know, publishers think critically about who they're identifying as the writers and the authors, as well as people who can provide those blurbs and the all-important book reviews. It's all part of a package that you present to potential readers. And that's why I'm really, you know, really happy to have been part of this project. I was able to add just 2 or 3 pages of context, and so that I think is probably the best outcome for this project in particular, was to be able to engage with this book that I read in law school, and then write a foreword for the next generation.
Oh, that's wonderful. Kiara, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, academic publishing. What I just want to kind of connect, I want to connect with something that Farina and Sarah touched on about how personal one's work is, right? And to me, I think some of the best scholarship is deeply personal. And, you know, as I mentioned, I didn't really know that much about Kennecott before reading the, you know, Herring's book, doing some research and writing the foreword. But so much of my work is about trying to fill in gaps, you know, curiosities, try to answer questions that I had as a young child and continue to have about how history is constructed and how we know what we know, and how that might impact the way we inhabit the world that we're in now. So that's something that I think I was very fortunate when it came to academic publishing, that my first book, Indigenous Intellectuals, is in a history series in Cambridge, but it's one that's focused on Native American history, and it's really wanting to, you know, shift some of the master narratives that we have about the United States. So I felt really honored to be able to have my book in that same series, one where you have Richard White's, you know, The Middle Ground, which was really a groundbreaking, and not meaning to make a pun, work around, you know, conceptualizing the interactions between colonizers and colonized, or Native people and non-Native people, and the tenuous kind of relationships that were formed in those early moments of contact. And, you know, then I find myself writing this book about Indigenous intellectuals of the early 20th century, who many of them traveled around quite a bit. They're very cosmopolitan, and they were really living in diaspora a lot of the time. And that's my own family's kind of story, right? You know, is that anything I've been able to learn about being Dakota or Apache is really from some books that my dad pushed towards me when I was a little kid, and I read, you know, nonfiction. And, you know, I was a nonfiction reader as a kid. I really loved nonfiction. So I guess I was meant to be a historian, because I wasn't reading Judy Blume. You know, I was like, give me a biography of Abraham Lincoln. I'll read that. I don't know why I was doing those things, but I just wanted to know more about the past in order to understand the present. And so I feel really, you know, honored to be able to continue to add to the story, and to try to complicate the story, and in that kind of complication, to help pull out some more nuance and make things not so simple, because we're really complicated, it turns out, right? People, society, we are. So why in the world would we look to the past and think, well, that was simple? Because of course it wasn't, right? There's all sorts of things happening. And I'm pretty sure my mom's in the audience listening right now. So I also want to just give her credit for, making me an intellectual and being the proofreader of every draft. So my book, before it was a book, was a dissertation, and before it was a dissertation, it was a really, really bad first draft that my mom read. So thanks, Mom, for that, because we need all of our relatives in their various forms, right, to help give us some perspective on the work that we do and the voices that we're carrying forward, and have those voices heard. So I just want to echo that and celebrate that idea.
That's wonderful. Hello, Kiara's mom. We're so happy you're joining us today. Okay, Farina, how about you? What's your experience in academic publishing been like?
I love that, Kiara, because I just thought a lot about how, understanding academic publishing, it can sound so exclusive, and far off. And that's the thing is why I made that video, for example, with my kids, is to help people realize this is a family behind this book. It's not just this invisible writer up in the sky or something. I don't know. Like that's sometimes what people think. They're so detached from understanding all that goes behind the book. And that's a part of also this conversation I'm really grateful we're having with this group, and everyone here. Thank you so much, because I'm trying to show that academic publishing and the process, it is always in flux too, and it really depends on who are the specific writers, as mentioned, but the communities, what are their protocols, especially in Indigenous studies. What we talk about Indigenous, we're talking about hundreds of very diverse peoples, I'm in Cherokee Nation right now. You see behind me, this is where my parents were living in Sabi in Discus, Monument Valley, but actually my ancestors and family are in Sayanichi, Rehoboth area of New Mexico. So even I love Sabi in Discus, Monument Valley. We have strong connections and relatives there. But even what I realized with my first book, the Earth Memory Compass, working, and that was my first experience really with full onslaught of academic publishing. I was really fortunate to have so many people support me, that community mom come into the archives with me, and while I was nursing to help with baby, dad coming with me to Navajo chapter local community meetings. And what mattered there was not, the PhDs that they were waiting to hear or whatever your letters are behind your name. It was, do you know Diné Bazad? Do you know Navajo language, how to speak and share your insights, or how you're showing your relationality, how you're related, and why this matters, to the community. And that was something related to your question with trends and academic publishing, is I felt like I was going through two often siloed tracks that are very different. I was seeking the approval and working with Navajo Nation and Diné communities, which is also even more complex. You have tribal governments compared to local and individual communities. So all that, those dynamics, and then, whatever scholars are reviewing your work and what they know and what they hold as the standard and the qualifications, and then a press and who are their peer reviewers, or all these different dynamics. And I'm trying to bridge that while seeking to also speak to multiple audiences in a book that will be published, is for the public, right? Educational. So I'm also seeking to write something that is meaningful for Diné, even my own family, my children, these communities, and then one that also can resonate and help connect with non-Diné, people, whoever they are, what's their background. And that's navigating all that. And so it really, to me, is a lot about understanding community and all these different inner workings of academic publishing that still, it can be rough, it can be really difficult. And I think that's why we need to have these conversations and talk about the future, not just trends, but, the approaches and how to go about that. How can academic presses familiarize themselves more with tribal nation protocols, permissions, different aspects? Because I worked with oral history and had to work with the Navajo Nation Human Research Review Board from the beginning of my doctoral research, and had to share that. And I don't think, people even understand fully what that all means, and even presses and such. So I think that's going to be really important. I mean, I was just on a thesis defense and work at Northeastern State University, where we have one of the largest Native American student presence in the country. And I was on a thesis defense of a student, a Muskogee student, actually. I'm really excited for him. He just successfully passed, so I can say that. And something he said, it just came to mind with all that was being shared of, and what I was thinking about of, he said in his writing, his Muskogee elders told him, there's some things you don't write down, you just don't write that down. And I think this will be familiar with a number of us, but it's not that these different Indigenous communities, like even my own communities, of Dene, that they don't want the public to know certain things, because again, Wilma Mankiller's key point that a lot of my Cherokee students and colleagues and friends say is, the imagery shapes policy, like those connections, and in a way, like narrative shape policy too, like media or whatever that is. And so absolutely, Indigenous communities and folks, they have narratives they want the public to know. So it's just balancing all these different dynamics that I think are going to be so key with how we navigate, academic publishing and the work, because overall it is that education, publicizing different words and narratives, but then how do we also support Indigenous sovereignty and communities of their well-being, and not being extractive, and still balancing that, even when we don't intend to, and we say, well, this is for the good, are we really having that conversation with Indigenous communities? And what was shared earlier about accessibility, we'll get into that, so that as well. Thank you.
So Kiara and Sarah, do you have anything else you'd like to add about some of those same topics?
I just think one thing that's really interesting to me, again, I'm a lawyer, so I didn't write a dissertation, and one of the things that was really fascinating to me when I entered academia is that, I had worked on these textbooks for tribal college textbooks in my work with a nonprofit, and I started to be, hearing this message that wasn't very prestigious. It wasn't really intellectual, and that, I guess I was kind of naive, I think, coming from a non-academic career and then moving into teaching full time. I just kind of was just kind of dense about some of it. But I thought, well, why don't textbooks count? I mean, that's how you reach students. And, I know that you may need to make certain benchmarks to get tenure. And so you're going to do the things that you need to do to get there. But, if I'm not reaching students, I don't want to write a book that people, that students would not want to read. So that was just one of the things that came to me, is just that the idea, like, oh, don't write down your textbooks at the top of your CV. And I was like, well, why not? Right? Because we don't do that. So I learned a lot the hard way, kind of going through that. But, if I wrote a book on sexual violence, and the book is for communities of Native people to decide what they want to do about this problem going forward. And the idea that there might be, I think I used this example before, but, a battered women's shelter on a reservation in Montana. Right? If they can't have access to my book, then I don't want to write it. I write thinking about the audience, not about myself. And I think what happens is that this kind of elitism that comes about with, where did you publish? Well, I published in Nebraska. Well, I published with Duke, that kind of thing. Students don't care. Students just want the material and they want to learn. That's all about us and our stuff, right? So I guess I don't know, that's kind of rambling, but yeah, that's one thing I would just add is that, textbooks need to be given, the credit they deserve, because that's how a lot of students get interested and learn about this stuff for the very first time.
I
Yes.
totally agree with that. And I just wanted to add, I mean, I wrote some entries for some encyclopedias for the same reason, right? Where I was excited to write about boarding schools or to write about, the Society of American Indians or some of these other important aspects of Native history that if they're not being put there, some people might not know, and also that it's teachers, right, at the secondary level and the college level who often need to turn to some of these texts in order to teach, right? And so just to give people some more information, I think that totally makes sense. One of the things I was really appreciating with this question and how people are answering it is just how relational all of this kind of work is, right? And how deeply relational it is. And there's a way in which Indigenous studies, I think, is helping to push academia to recognize that relationality is not just about citation. It's not just about saying, I read these things, I know these scholars' work, and so you should trust that I know what I'm saying, but it's about how to honor that exchange of knowledge. And so I was thinking of it in the example of the early Dakota historians and Lakota historians who kept winter counts, right? So they're recording, on hides or on muslin, critical events, right, in their communities. But they're not doing it alone, right? So there's the winter count keeper, but they are always consulting with elders, other community leaders, and other people in order to decide what images and symbols are we going to use, because which events do we think are the most significant, right? And we're going to chronicle that, but we're going to also talk about it, right? So like this idea that not everything is written, that there is a communication that happens through story, through conversation, that the exchange of knowledge is iterative and cyclical, right? And relational. And so, you've got the kind of winter count as a record, right? Almost some sort of like a calendar or an almanac, however you want to think of it. But then it's really also about that interplay with the people who know what those symbols mean and can talk about them with other people. And that's how history is, carried forward. And so I felt like I was feeling that as Farina was talking and as Sarah was talking about just the connections that we make with other people in order to, tell the stories that we tell and to reach as wide an audience as we can with those stories.
That's wonderful. Farina, did you have anything else on that topic you wanted to add?
I mean, I think those are really what came to mind, because I wanted to start talking about what all this also seeps into is the question of accessibility too, right? Is audience and then accessibility, because how a person writes, like getting different feedback on the book was, I have different audiences pushing really heavy theory and references to different terms, and then others who are just like, I want the story. Like, can, certain of my relatives, for instance, they're not reading, Gramsci or whatever, different people. And so how I balance that too, is there, that's always a question for me. And then accessibility also on the level of what we'll talk about with open access, but, internet access, multimedia. But then what I was getting at before was I sense as well in academic circles, or not just academic circles, just learning circles, I'll call them this, a tension between when, especially with Native American and Indigenous peoples, and there's a long history to this that everyone on this panel, you all, I know your work has delved into, of this approach of scholarship, like it's a salvaging scholarship, right? And it's preserving, and so it has to take as much information as it can, right? And then there's this shock when the community is saying, well, we want our stories for ourselves. These ones are for us, but we want support to do that. Like sometimes they need funding or support. Like I'm in oral history organizations, and the need for, new kind of equipment or how to use that the communities do want to use. But then they want to keep, different parts of that for themselves, and that kind of informational sovereignty too, that gets into it. And then other groups are like, well, we can't support that because that's not public. They're not sharing that, and there's a tension I've run into recently, and that's very unsettling for me, because this disconnect that's continuing of individuals who are demanding, like, not seeing that they can't support something they think that's for the individual, like, oh, they're just wanting that to be private, like this language of that's private accessibility compared to public accessibility. But it's more complicated than that. It's not that simple binary. So I hope that there can be accessibility navigating with all the kind of technologies we're working into, working on and developing. There are these different ways of, songs or stories, also projects or efforts of what folks call repatriation, rematriation. There's already all these precious sources out there, and communities do not have even access to them, in this kind of knowledge. So that's what I'm also concerned about, that this is all intertwined. It is, of how the scholarship is done and shared and through publishing, and there's a part in that. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Thank you, Farina. This is such a wonderful conversation. I'm assuming everyone is enjoying it on their little screens at home. So let's get to the next question here. And Farina, that was a wonderful transition. So for all of you, and maybe we'll just go in order again, Sarah, if you want to start us off. What is the importance of open access books to students and the public, especially for Indigenous studies titles?
I think, I've trained a lot of non-Indians on Indian law over the years. And that includes non-Indian lawyers who have brilliant command of most of the areas of law they practice, but they didn't even realize tribes had courts, So it's fascinating to me that, do we write then to educate the non-Indian, or are we writing for the Indian audience? And how can we do both? And for me, or should we do both, right? And for me, I have found some of my best writing working with a non-Indigenous author. So of course, in the world of legal academia, articles are more important than books. I mean, it's just weird, everything's a little different. So I've written several articles with either students or former students, non-Indians, who discovered, right, Indian law in law school, and were like, I didn't even know this was a thing. And so, well, I'm not, Indian law in terms of Supreme Court decisions and Title 25 and all of that is not particularly like cultural in any way. It's just a settler colonial law. But I have found that that's really helped me, because I'm assuming things that people already know. So when I've partnered with somebody who's non-Indigenous, they're able to help me reach a broader audience in terms of who could read it, who would be willing to try to understand it and get behind it. And again, co-authorship is another thing that's kind of like a question, right? Did you really write that? How much of that did you write? Why is your name listed first? All of those kinds of things come up. But that's just one thing that I have found that I think helps me make my work more accessible. And like I said, a lot of that comes in articles instead of books.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Kiara?
I don't have too much to add, except for I do think for Indigenous studies titles, like why open access would be important. I mean, part of this is about making things go beyond academia, I think, right? Because I think Native studies at the community level, like in Native communities, they're they're knowledge keepers, right? And their knowledge is immense, and they share it in all sorts of ways. And then I think there are academics, some of them native, some of them not, some of them mixed like myself, right? And there's lots of work that's happening. And how do we bridge kind of those different communities? How do we bring them together? And maybe open access is the way to do that, right? To have titles made available to people more easily, and to kind of bridge that digitally, right? When we can be so far apart from one another physically. So I definitely see those as huge, huge benefits.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Farina, how about you?
I think this open access movement is tremendously important. It can't be undermined. I mean, it can't be overemphasized, because first of all, with college students at this time and all the rising costs and expenses, I mean, just the reality of the struggles that they face, this is an opportunity of all of them, and educators, you know, being able to provide this access and not adding, you know, another cost, and that, you know, I certainly know would impact my students who are, you know, we have 30% Native or more at our school, a strong presence of Native American students and community here. And I know most of our students, this is a really big issue of affording their books. It's a big struggle for students to be able to come to college, the responsibilities they hold for family, for work. And I mean, now look at this context of COVID-19 pandemic, emphasizing these disparities, war in the world and rising gas prices and all these things. So even just being able to pay, you know, $50 for a book or something is a real hurdle. It is a roadblock for students, and it's heartbreaking, you know, that they're facing this. So this is alleviating, you know, this is a fresh breath of air. It can be inspiring of like, wow, I can access this. Not to mention, not only, you know, college students who are signed up, so to speak, you know, to get these books and being responsible, finding a way to afford them, but also, you know, independent scholars, intellectuals, community intellectuals who often, you know, reach out to me. I've had people message me and say, I can't get your article, you know, how can I get that? I really want to read this. I need to. I'm working with this community. And or they're asking me about recommended books and different things like that, that people have that hunger. They're thirsting to learn. And this is opening that door for them of why this matters, giving more opportunity for them. And so I'm meeting with different, you know, communities and groups in that way. So I think, you know, those for me is why it is so important, is meeting like, and even with my publishing question, a big question for me was affordability. Absolutely. How can I get this to my communities? Because I'm not given a bunch of free books. I'm not, you know, those Harry Potter writer, right, who makes all the big bucks on these books. I wish I could just hand out my books to people. That to me is so crushing. I just want to hand this out even to, you know, the descendants of all these boarding school families and such, you know, even my own relatives. And that can be hard, even if it's, you know, keeping it low at $20 or whatever it is, when it adds up with all the folks who can read it. So this is so great in really opening that up and the accessibility. And thank you. Thank you to the sponsors, the Mellon, the NEH, you know, the way we get these books in people's hands. Because I tell you, I've written, you know, op-ed about this. I've talked about this with different people. I was born in Tonanez in Navajo Nation, and have lived, like, been a wanderer in many ways, lived in many different places. My dad worked for Indian Health Service, and we lived in different places for that, but especially the Washington, D.C. area. And I was meeting people, and when I told them, you know, when they met my family, me, and learning about my Native American background, and then now I study Native American studies, I just hear the craziest things, but this is their reality of what, there's still Indians left, you're not all dead, and just the ignorance and everything. I mean, it is changing with social media, the movements and impacts of certainly Standing Rock and Standing Up No Dapple movement, but there's still so much work to do of minoritized communities that have been marginalized. This is even the title, the enduring Indians, not the vanishing ones, right? But changing those narratives that are still really stuck on people. And I will say that's both Native and non-Native, even Natives who know, like, we're still here. The accessibility to knowledge and that knowledge sharing, who are, writing the curriculum, who is giving those textbooks that Sarah mentioned, they are huge, because who's writing them that the children, our children, my children are learning in these public school systems. This is a real struggle over education and such. So these university presses are doing incredible work in supporting scholars who are doing this, opening it up for accessibility and all these aspects.
If I can jump in here, I just wanted to add one other thing, just that something you said just reminded me, I really didn't want to put up a sarahdeer.com website. I resisted it for a long time because it just, I don't know, it felt too like self-aggrandizing or something. But I ended up doing it largely to give access to my work, because even if, even if a lot of law reviews now, which is where most of my work is published, are turning open access. But if you're Googling, you might hit a paywall, right? And then not know that there may be a way around that by going directly to the law review website or something like that. So they may hit a paywall, whether they're at a university paywall or they don't have access to a university account, right? So I took everything that I have the right to share, which is not all of my articles, but most of them, and just put them all in one place, one website. And that has really, it's actually saved me some time, because people will, email me and want to know where I can find these articles, and I can just say, you can go to my website. And so as I watch the law journals move in that direction, it's been a really great way for me to communicate with my potential readers by posting them just all in one place. But I don't know what else I wanted to say about that. It is a really strange color outside for Kansans. That means that we're about to get something really big. So I just wanted to say something before. My power is really iffy, and if it's just a little, even just a little bit, I'll go black. But I just wanted to chime in there on that question.
Kiara, do you have anything else you want to add about open access? No? Okay, well, I might move into our audience questions. So I know we've got a few in there. If any of you want to submit some, feel free to do that now, and we'll go through some of these, and I will go through them with you. Okay, so let's see. Oh, are there MARC records that libraries can add to their library catalog so people can search by keywords or subject headings to locate the digital copies of these books? That sounds like a specific question for our KU Libraries colleagues, but that's a great question. Now, I do believe at KU that they have moved the titles into the catalog. So if you're looking for either of those Herring books, that when you find them, it'll show you that they have a copy that's accessed through the internet, and you will be able to get that there. But I do think if any of you are at other institutions, I'm not at KU, for example, and I've communicated with my librarians, this is something to educate your library colleagues about, to let them know that these titles are open access, and to add them into their library systems in ways that make sense for your institution. So I think that is a really important thing, is to get the word out, which is part of why we're having our event today, is to help educate you on access to these. Yes, Farina.
Could I add something too about that?
Sure.
That I wanted to say, related to open access and this question of, how people are finding this. Yes, they often go to the library, but I think also encouraging people to go to the press websites, learn about these presses, familiarize yourselves with the press websites directly, and that, there are the links there, because I did want to say support when you can, like I get that there's funding that goes into, all the work behind the scene and keeping these presses going. And that's what I realized as well over the last couple of years of how, at risk our university presses are and how valuable they are. And we need to support in any way we can. And a big way to do that is, so go to their website, even if it's that open access there, and buy what books that you can, if you can, but then this is a way of opening that accessibility and support and directing people there too. So that's something I wanted to say.
Yeah, that's a great point, Farina. I will say, in case you in the audience aren't aware, none of us are making any money off of our academic books. They exist with whatever small margins there are to help fund the press, not to fund the careers of the people who are writing this work. So, Kiara, I have another one for you. Would you argue that Kennecook is an Indigenous intellectual?
I like that. Why not? I'd say why not? Because I feel like part of being an intellectual is being conversant in different knowledge systems. And I think Kennecook really was. Like, I think Kennecook had a deep cultural and epistemological understanding of Kickapooness, let's say, but also Christianity and the ways in which there were, different systems of understanding this world that we live in, how to be in it, how to navigate it, how to treat people correctly. And he had a really, really complicated sense of that. So in that way, I would say for sure an intellectual.
That's wonderful. Okay, so another question. Both Sarah and Kiara both wrote forwards to books authored by the same person, Joseph Herring. And Sarah, you specifically said in your intro about how Herring covered a subject that no one else really has written about before or since,
Right.
in terms of the 4 tribes of Kansas. So if you could see someone else write, like, let's imagine a second edition or sort of a, next phase about the 4 tribes of Kansas, what would you like to see someone cover?
Kind of pick up where his book ends in 1990. There's a lot of things that have happened to Indian tribes since 1990. I also think I even put this in the forward, is that we really need to make sure that we have scholars, we have Kickapoo scholars writing about Kickapoo history. I don't like to sort of bash white male historians, but there's a problem for decades, right? Where all of these Indian histories are written by white men. And so I would really like to see the cultivation of tribal historians who can be conversant both locally within their tribal community about everything under the sun, and then share some of that knowledge as appropriate with the public. So that's really important to me. The other thing about this book, it's not just about the 4 tribes. I think it's a little bit misleading. It's also about all of the Native people that were moved through the state. And when you talk about the Trail of Tears, the average American is going to think, oh, it was a trail of Cherokee tears, right? Like there was just the one, right? And so I really like to educate on, when I'm talking about Indian law to students, is to say there were hundreds of trails of tears, and it wasn't just the Cherokees, whatever the Walking Dead might have taught you, and so it's important for, I think, for those of us who are invested in being Kansans, to understand that there were trails of tears coming straight down through the territory for decades, and to be honest with ourselves about that history. And when we talk about Kansas History Day, we should be talking about these things. I again started to ramble, but that's sort of, yeah, my experience with the book would be to cultivate tribal citizens to write their own histories.
Yeah. So just to say, if we have any university administrators in our audience, that sounds like a pathway that Sarah is mentioning that we should develop from Indigenous communities through our higher ed institutions. Kiara, were you going to speak to maybe what you'd like to see book 2 for Kennecook look like?
I mean, I think Herring has some, in what I call, unsettling lenses through which he frames his narrative of Kennecook and how to understand Kennecook's legacy. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to actually go back into the archives and into oral histories and into other materials to try to, add more nuance to Herring's portrait. So I actually think people could write more about Kennecook and much more about some of the conflicts that are in that he and his people are a part of, but then even the kind of broader context as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to do that.
That's wonderful. All right, well, I think we're at about time. So I know David has some closing remarks. So is there anything the three of you would like to share before we conclude?
Well, mainly, I just want to say thank you so much to David, Ty, Sarah, Kiara, and to Kelly, everyone who's here taking this time and space. Thank you so much for all the work you do. As mentioned, this can be really thankless work, like tiring work sometimes. And so even listening, that's work to listen to this and then to act on that. So thank you.
Yeah, I'll echo the thanks. Pidama Yayapi. So thank you all.
Mido, thank you.
Yes, and I want to thank all of you. Also, wonderful panel. I think we all learned so much, and I'm really grateful for your time, and I'm really grateful for the press for organizing this. So, David, I think you have a few little remarks to share with our audience.
Well, thank you to Ty, and thank you to all the panelists. This was fantastic, wonderful conversation. So I just to close, if you want to have more information about the Kansas Open Books, please go to the University Press of Kansas website. You can find information there about all the titles and links to the open access ebooks. You can also find them through Project Muse and through JSTOR as well. So they should be accessible through university database systems. In addition to that, you can also purchase print versions of those books as well. So if you want a hard copy of those books with the new forewords and prefaces, you can get those. And also, I should say, please check out our newer titles as well, including books by Farina King, The Earth Memory Compass, and Ty Edwards, Sage Women Empire, and many other books as well. So check out the website for more information on all of those. But thank you all so much again. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you all for watching and listening. Thank you, and have a good night.